Imagine if today, the biggest sports car manufacturers like Toyota, Ferrari, BMW and Porsche were all given the challenge to make the fastest, most powerful race car possible, with no limits on their technology, be it aerodynamic restrictions or engine restrictions. The result would likely be similar to the Porsche 919 Evo, a no expense spared race car built for nothing but going around a racetrack rather quickly. Now this car was obviously never meant to race in any racing series or compete, but it was made as a marketing stunt and as a proof of concept by Porsche to showcase the technology they developed as a part of their 919 program. But what if there was a time where cars like this weren't just developed as a marketing stunt? What if an entire racing series existed where there were no restrictions and manufacturers were allowed free rein to produce and race whatever they wanted without restraint? Well, back in the 60s and 70s, that's exactly what happened. The Canadian-American Challenge Cup, otherwise known as Can-Am, was a new series put forward by John Bishop, who then got backing from the SCCA and CASC. Can-Am was a response to the rising popularity of sports car racing in North America. Unlike the heavily regulated championships in Europe, Can-Am provided an open playground to manufacturers and engineers who could experiment freely with no restrictions on what they can and can't do. Can-Am quickly attracted major talent to the series, with names like John Surtees, Graham Hill, Bruce McLaren, Chris Amon, Mark Donohue and Dan Gurney, all being in attendance for the inaugural Can-Am season in 1966. The early days of Can-Am were shaped by three main manufacturers: Chaparral, Lola and McLaren. The Lola T70 quickly became the car of choice for the 1966 season. Powered by a 5-litre Chevrolet V8 producing around 500 horsepower and weighing just over 800 kilos, it gave the car an incredible power to weight ratio. This was the car that helped put Lola on the map and helped cement their status as a serious contender in the new series. Lola's main rival in the early days was McLaren. When Bruce McLaren entered Can-Am, he didn't just want to compete, he wanted to win. He entered the new McLaren M1A, a 420 horsepower V8 monster. Paired with a lightweight monocoque and superb balance, it was a competitive car, leading him to third in the 1966 season. Even though the M1A never won a race, it set the foundations for the M6A, a car which dominated the 1967 season, winning 5 of the 6 races that year. The Chaparral was the odd one out of the three. As the others stuck to big power in a small form, Chaparral was interested in the aerodynamic innovation. The Chaparral 2E was a revolutionary car, being one of the first cars to feature an active rear wing. Since the car was an automatic, they could replace the foot clutch with a pedal that adjusted the wing's angle, which enabled the car to reach higher top speed while maintaining the downforce in the corners. The 2E only managed to win one race in the hands of Phil Hill. Despite this, it was a firm crowd favourite and one of the most revolutionary race cars of all time. Shadow Racing quickly became known for producing some of the most radical cars Can-Am has ever seen. Their first Can-Am car they produced, the Shadow Mark I, was a tiny, knee-high go-kart with a huge 700 horsepower big block Chevrolet engine bolted in the back. The idea behind the Mark I was epic straight-line speed using the design philosophy of having the smallest front surface area possible, which was definitely accomplished, being 13 square foot compared to the McLaren's 19 square foot, and being capable of speeds of around 250 miles an hour. However, due to the tiny wheels and virtually non-existent suspension travel, it had horrible problems with bouncing and brake cooling. Aside from the technical issues the car suffered, it was also horrible to drive from an ergonomics perspective, with possibly some of the weirdest pedals ever found in a race car. Because the car was so low, there was barely any room for the driver's feet. The pedals were crammed into an impossibly tight space, where the driver had to rest their foot horizontally to the pedal. This made controlling the already unstable car even more difficult. Shadow didn't stop experimenting after the Mark I. They then produced the Mark II, which was a slightly more conventional Can-Am car compared to the Mark I. The car still had a very small front end, and suffered from the same brake problems as the Mark I, but the car was remarkably competitive, qualifying in the top 5 in all but one of the 8 races in the 1971 season. However, the reliability issues proved to be too big to overcome, only managing to score 2 podiums. Shadow also produced a few more interesting cars over the years, but I think we can save those for a later video. While Shadow experimented with their interesting machines, Chaparral continued to innovate their aerodynamic concepts. In 1970 they introduced the Chaparral 2J, one of the most iconic cars ever made in the series. The Chaparral 2J was the first car to introduce the idea of ground effect into the world of racing. Jim Hall, the man behind these contraptions, designed the 2J with a fan system mounted at the rear of the car to create additional downforce. These fans would suck the car to the ground, creating a vacuum-like effect. The car proved effective, qualifying over 2 seconds in front of the next fastest car at Riverside. However, the 2J quickly got banned after its initial success, with teams pleading to the SCCA suggesting it was dangerous, due to the fans sucking up bits of debris and shooting them at the car behind like a bullet after being exhausted by the fans. McLaren in particular were arguing that if the car was allowed to race in the Can-Am series, it would be ruined through its dominance. While controversial, Chaparral 2J demonstrated the potential of active aerodynamics and paved the way for the technology which later found its way into Formula 1 through teams like Lotus and Brabham. Whilst McLaren had been dominating Can-Am in the late 60s and early 70s, Porsche had been developing its existing 917/10, and in 1971 Porsche built an iteration of its famous 917 prototype race car into a Can-Am machine. With new bodywork and weight stripped back to a minimum, it competed in the 1971 season with Joe Siffert, who was the main Porsche development driver for the 917 Can-Am program, achieving a handful of podiums. Unfortunately, Siffert would not see the outcome of the 917 program, being killed in an accident at Brands Hatch later in the year. Even with Joe Siffert no longer being a driving force behind the program, Porsche decided to return the following year, this time with a full-scale attempt to win in Can-Am. This car ran the same 5-litre flat 12, but was slightly modified to include the use of 2 turbochargers. These added lots of power to the little Porsche, and George Follmer won the 1972 Can-Am Championship with the 917/10. Riding on the back of the success in 1972, Porsche returned again with a newly improved car, the 917/30. This was the final iteration of the 917, and it was one of the most powerful race cars to have ever been created. The car featured all new bodywork, and the twin turbocharged engine was slightly enlarged from 5 litres to 5.4 litres. The car was now producing a huge 1100 horsepower, however, Porsche engineers could crank it up to an incredible 1580 horsepower with full boost. Interestingly, both the 917/10 and the 917/30 were the only non-Chevrolet powered cars to win the Can-Am Championship in its entire existence. The Porsche 917/30 was so dominating, many sources cite it as being the reason Can-Am dropped off in popularity. Sports car legend and Can-Am racer Brian Redman stated the Porsche 917/30 was the car that killed the Can-Am series because of the development done by Penske, Donahue and Porsche. My personal take on it was it wasn't the Porsche that directly killed Can-Am, rather it was a number of things all coming together at once. The championship's title sponsor pulled out, leaving less prize money, meaning drivers suddenly weren't as interested as before in competing. Alongside this, the previously no rules no restrictions ethos of the championship had taken a hit after banning the Chaparral 2J. Above all else though, I think it was the oil crisis that was the last nail in the coffin. In 1974, there wasn't even a Daytona 24-hour or 12 hours of Sebring due to the crisis. It was a tough time to run a racing series, and Can-Am was no exception. In 1974, due to the oil crisis, the SCCA were forced to re-evaluate the Can-Am formula. They turned the no-rules 7-litre V8 monsters into a more tamed fuel economy based formula. They required each of the cars to achieve a minimum of 3 miles per gallon. This prompted many of the teams to leave. McLaren had already left prior to the 1973 season, mainly attributed to a couple of reasons, like not being able to figure out turbocharging or wanting to focus their efforts on Formula 1 and IndyCar. Besides, not like they had anything to prove after they won 5 straight championships in a row. Now, with everything turned on its head and most of the teams having left, Shadow Racing Cars, headed by Tony Southgate, sweeped up what was remaining of the 4 of the 5 rounds held in 1974, with the money running low and the crowds running even lower. After 5 of the planned 8 rounds, the series was cancelled. Jackie Oliver, the 1974 champion, later said, "It was a dinosaur period, it was unsustainable." That was the appeal of the cars. They were unbelievable to drive, and they were unbelievable to watch. Can-Am then cancelled the 1975 and 1976 season due to lack of interest. However, In 1977, the SCCA decided to revive the Can-Am name. After watching the decline of Can-Am and bearing witness to the stagnation of their Formula 5000 series, they decided to combine Can-Am and Formula 5000. This led to the introduction of the single-seat Can-Am cars. The new cars in the series weren't custom-made experimental prototypes, but rather Formula 5000 based cars, making them all single-seaters. While the Formula 5000 based cars were all very similar if not the same underneath, some engineers still tried to bring back the experimental aspect of Can-Am. The Ski is a prime example of this. The crazy spaceship-like bodywork was a draw for fans and race promoters alike, and the car even managed to win the first race of the 1977 season. The series was a little rocky for the first couple of seasons, but then it grew in 1979 and had 3 great years of racing. These saw the introduction of cars like the March 817, Lola T530 and the Frisbee. However, in the early 80s, kart and IMSA started to show themselves as the new pinnacle of circuit racing in America. This prompted a lot of the top level teams to turn to kart or IMSA, leaving Can-Am behind. In the last few years of the series, it became nothing more than a club level series. The series tried to gather more interest by allowing March 85Cs from kart to compete, but this did not generate enough interest to keep the series going. Can-Am subsequently folded at the end of the 1987 season and has not returned since. Thanks for staying around to the end of my video on the brief history of Can-Am. I hope you enjoyed watching. If you'd like to subscribe, that would be very nice, and any feedback would be greatly appreciated in the comments, and thank you again.